That the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to use my time in this third reading of this bill to really clarify what I think are the quite justifiable questions that the opposition are asking here. This is not an attempt to politicise a situation that clearly, absolutely needs to be rectified. No question, that's why it's being passed unanimously through this House. I can see Mr Saber muttering over there with quiet, silent rage, and he must be quite upset. He must be quite upset that he doesn't get to use his 10 minutes. Perhaps Minister Tolley might let him have his full 10 minutes for that. I just want to clarify that that Labor is not liberally spreading the blame across our police force over the fact that we're having to deal with this issue today. Of course not. In fact, rightly so, we've acknowledged the work that the police do on behalf of all of us in our communities, an incredibly tough job in which we constantly ask of them to reinforce the notion that no matter how much disrespect they are treated with, that they continually treat others with constant respect. That is what we ask of our police officers daily, and by and large they do an absolutely fantastic job for us. We acknowledge that. But what we are saying here today, Mr Speaker, is that yes, an error was made back in the way that the original legislation passed in 2008 was enacted functionally on the ground. That was rectified in 2009. Now, usually, of course, under normal circumstances, it probably would be unfair to say that the Minister should have oversight of every single little individual issue that's been implemented in the 2008 Act. Under normal circumstances, that would be a fair comment for the government to make. But this was not a usual circumstance. The House went into urgency in 2009 to make a specific change to the law. Retrospective legislation was passed to cover the fact that for a period, one part of the 2008 Act was not implemented correctly. Now, that should have been a flag then to a minister, that actually an area where she probably wouldn't usually have functionally operated any oversight, to just ask some questions. Now, that does not interrupt the concept of constabulary independence, which is an incredibly important principle, just as is the independence of the judiciary. Very important principles. But we cannot blur the line between, of course, needing to maintain constabulary independence and ensuring proper accountability for a minister who has oversight of the operational day-to-day functions of the police. So because a set of unusual circumstances did arise, Mr Speaker, I think then it's fair to say that at that point, having the minister say, well, look, OK, this law's been passed, please in my next briefing or update with the Commissioner, at least demonstrate to me that the proper authorisations have been administered for those who are now giving out those oaths. Just one question, one briefing. That's all it would have taken. And that's not unusual. Once a piece of legislation has been implemented, it's not unusual for a minister to ask for an update on implementation. Absolutely not. And because this is one very specific question, it would not have taken much to ask that. So I do want to highlight that. Yes, constabulary independence, incredibly important. But I see time and time again that used as an excuse when actually what we're asking for is simple ministerial accountability. So we need to make sure it's applied correctly, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, in my first address, I spoke briefly to some of the things that are going on generally within the police right now. It is, I think, only right to mention that the Police Association, as we speak, are at their conference, their annual conference, and it was a real pleasure to join with them last night at that event. But I wouldn't want to leave the House with the view that the 63 officers since 2009 who have come back into the police force somehow demonstrates this amazing recruitment drive and increase in policing numbers. In fact, those 63 returning officers represent more in terms of numbers than what the police force has grown in its entirety since 2009. In fact, we've only had an increase of 52 police officers, sworn staff, since 2009. Now, putting that into context, Mr Speaker, That's under a government who promised New Zealand that we would have functionally one staff member per 500 New Zealanders. That means we should have had an extra 252 frontline officers if that government stuck to their word, but they haven't. Now, what they may claim is that, sure, we've only got 52 more officers, according to the annual report, but there's, of course, all the non-sworn staff and the various roles that they play. Well, let's just be very clear about what's happened to non-sworn staff who perform an incredibly important job on behalf of the policing family. They may not be sworn staff, but sworn staff see how important and know how important their role is. They are the ones that do all of the work that frees up, often much of the work that frees up police to do that frontline policing, those patrols that we expect of the police, and which the Minister claims that they are doing more of. There are 234 fewer non-sworn staff now than in 2009. That means the burden of those tasks are now falling squarely on sworn officers, 234. Now, that hasn't just been because people have left. Let's be absolutely clear. There was a restructure in 2012 which was extraordinarily unsettling for the police generally, not just for the non-sworn staff. The sworn staff felt acutely the fact that the people who were supporting them in their work were either restructured out of their jobs, asked to take early retirement, or asked to apply again in cities that were quite a distance from even where they were performing their duties at that time. I know it affected a number of police officers and police stations deeply, and the volunteers who work for them. And of course, we need to remember that there are a number of volunteers who work with our police force. I had the pleasure of knowing one of New Zealand's longest-serving police volunteers, Ian Jenkins, who served with the New Zealand Police in Morrinsville from memory for over 30 years and did an incredibly stellar job. We cannot ignore that it's not just sworn police officers who play a role in keeping our communities safe. It's all the people who sit around them, and I know the police would want me to mention that and want me to mention how unsettling that period was. Mr Goff already talked about what that has meant regionally, and I think it's important to focus on it. When we use these stats at a national level, it's easy to lose sight of what that means for a community. But in counties Manukau, 104 fewer police personnel is going to have a significant impact on a community like that, where, of course, our expectation is not that the police simply play a role of response, inquire, arrest. We for a long time have asked the police to form a much bigger role than that, Mr Speaker. And in fact, their own Commissioner has significantly changed the focus of the police with the notion of prevention first. We applaud prevention first as an initiative. It's fantastic. But it does require police to be able to manage their file and caseload of their major criminal investigations and caseload. Unless they're able to do that, it's very hard to implement this wider notion of prevention first. It's harder to ask them to do some of those early interventions and preventative work when they're just doing the day-to-day file management that they're required to do as part of their frontline duties. So we all lose, Mr Speaker, when we have a police force that are feeling those kinds of pressures on them. And that is bearing out in some of the survey work that we've seen, where the police have said only a quarter of our cops claim to be fully engaged in their work. And the number that are leaving is significant. In 2013, the average monthly resignations have doubled, Mr Speaker, since 2008. Clearly, these are police officers who are feeling the pressure of having less support around them, the increasing demands, the fact that their budgets are barely keeping up with inflation, and this is bearing out in their ability to do the job that they signed up to via the oaths, which we are now fixing today. So, Mr Speaker, those are the issues that I hope the Minister continues to focus on. I think the questions we've asked today have been fair, and I would really appreciate a member of the government benches clarifying some of those questions we've asked. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just want to clarify one thing that